By the late 1400s, Europeans were eager to explore new worlds for wealth and power, driven by gold fever and the promise of quick riches, and increasingly addicted to sugar, which would shape centuries of global trade and exploitation. Before Europeans ever dreamed of a sugar rush, the Caribbean was home to the Taíno and Kalinago peoples. Their wealth wasn't shiny yellow rocks, no, it was cassava bread, fish, and, most importantly, knowing how not to get sunburned. And trust me, that's priceless. Then in 1492, Christopher Columbus showed up, holding out a gold coin like it was a magic trick. The Taíno looked at it and probably thought, it's just a shiny rock, but you can't eat it? Spain came searching for gold. Instead, they found disappointment. No mountains of treasure here, just heat, mosquitoes, and confused locals. Real treasure, the silver, came from Mexico and Peru. So Columbus tried something else. On his second trip in 1493, he brought a few stalks of sugarcane. Those stalks grew like weeds, the world's most dangerous houseplant. Gold was finite. Sugar was infinite. And unlike gold, you couldn't just lock sugar in a box. You had to harvest, boil, and ship it. That meant labor, lots of labor, lots of labor. Sugar was once considered so valuable that it was worth the same as gold, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries. The most notable period was in the early colonial era, when sugar was introduced to Europe as a luxury item. It was grown in large quantities in the Caribbean, and due to its rarity and the difficulty of production, it was as costly as gold in some parts of Europe. In fact, sugar became a symbol of wealth and status, especially in the courts of Europe. At first, colonists forced indigenous people to work the mines and fields, but disease, massacres, and overwork decimated them. Besides, the indigenous knew the land better. When they escaped, they vanished like a magician's rabbit. Still, harvesting sugar requires lots of labor. Indentured servants sometimes worked in the colonies under contract, harsh conditions, often deadly. But this was temporary and not hereditary and not enough. Still, they needed more labor that can work longer. Before the Atlantic trade, slavery existed within Europe. In antiquity, Greeks and Romans enslaved other Europeans. During the Middle Ages, Slavic peoples, hence the word slave, were frequently enslaved by both Europeans and Muslim traders. By the 15th to 16th centuries, however, most of Europe had phased out traditional slavery, shifting to serfdom or wage labor systems. This didn't mean freedom was equal, but it meant the institution of lifelong hereditary slavery within Europe itself had declined. Europeans wanted free labor, so Spain turned to Africa. Why? West Africa was close to Atlantic shipping routes, and African leaders were already selling war captives or debtors in existing slave markets. Africans had centuries of experience farming in tropical climates. Long before the slave trade, Africans had domesticated crops like sorghum, millet, African rice, yams, and okra. They developed farming systems that thrived in deserts, rainforests, and savannas, real agricultural scientists without lab coats. Europeans saw that knowledge and thought, perfect, free labor with a green thumb. And so began history's cruelest substitution, gold for sugar and people for profit. Africans weren't enslaved because of their skin color or some protection against the sun. That excuse came later. They were enslaved because Europeans needed labor, and Africa's fractured kingdoms made people vulnerable to capture. And here's the geography twist. If geography were the only factor, the Caribbean might have been filled with Chinese or Indian laborers centuries earlier. But India had powerful empires, and China had dynasties strong enough to retaliate. Europeans depended on trade with those regions. Enslaving them at scale would have been risky business. Africa, divided into smaller kingdoms, looked like an easier target, and Africa itself is huge and ecologically diverse. Deserts, rainforests, savannas, mountains. This diversity made it hard to build and maintain massive empires with unified control. A king in one region couldn't easily march an army 500 miles through rainforest or desert. That fragmentation gave Europeans the opening they wanted. In Africa, they already had tribal slavery, which was often temporary, war captives, debt servitude, sometimes even adoption into households. Brutal, yes, but not lifelong, not generational. Many in tribal slavery could marry, earn status, or eventually gain freedom. In the Caribbean, whole new rules. Industrial slavery, where slavery became chattel slavery. Lifelong, inherited and dehumanizing, reduced to property. Europeans turned the innocent descendants into the fuel for their sugar empire. White slaves, indentured servants, or Barbary captives suffered brutal conditions, high mortality, and harsh punishment. But they had pathways out through time limits, ransom, or integration. African slavery in the Caribbean was industrialized, permanent, hereditary, and racialized in a way no European population ever faced on the same scale. White servants remained legally human. Enslaved Africans became legally property. If tribal slavery was a scar, plantation slavery was an open wound that never healed. In the 1600s to 1700s, Europe developed a sweet tooth. Sugar changed from a luxury for the rich to a common product for tea, coffee, chocolate, and pastries. Prices were high enough that even small colonial holdings could make huge profits. Sugar was labor-intensive but very profitable, and it became the centerpiece of the triangular trade. By the 1600s, the Caribbean became Europe's battleground dessert tray. England, France, and the Dutch all wanted a slice. In 1623, the island of St. Kitts became the first British colony. In 1627, Barbados. In 1635, the French on Martinique and Guadeloupe. What began as farms turned into mega factories. Britain especially scaled up ships, merchants, banks, even parliament, all sticky with sugar money. No country perfected the sugar and slavery system quite like Britain. By the 18th century, Britain were the undisputed leaders of the trade, moving more Africans across the Atlantic than anyone else. Enter the infamous triangle trade. Ships left Europe with guns and goods, traded them with African leaders for human lives. African leaders used those guns to raid neighboring villages and attack rival kingdoms to capture more human lives. Many African leaders sold captives from rival groups to Europeans, often for weapons and goods. Some kingdoms even reorganized their economies around raiding for captives. Europeans shipped those lives across the Atlantic, returned to Europe with sugar, rum, and molasses. Sweetness for Europe, bitterness for millions. Not all African leaders joined the trade. Some fought Europeans or refused to sell their people. King Afonso I of Congo, 1520s, protested Portuguese slave trading, and yet enslaved people resisted at every step. Silent slowdowns, sabotage, open revolt. In 1733, enslaved Akwamu rebels seized much of St. John in the Virgin Islands. In 1763, the Bourbis Revolt. Starting in 1791, the Haitian Revolution erupted. By 1804, Haiti was the world's first free black republic. Napoleon, humiliated, supposedly muttered, "Fine. Keep your sugar, I'll sell Louisiana instead." In other words, he traded one colony for a whole continent, history's most lopsided bargain. Let's pause here. Race was not handed down by nature, it was man-made. A story written into law books and slave codes. Europeans created categories. White meant free, black meant enslaved. It kept poor Europeans from uniting with Africans because at least they weren't chained. Divide and conquer. One of history's oldest tricks. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there was an intellectual movement called the Age of Enlightenment that sought to improve society through fact-based reason and inquiry. The Enlightenment brought secular thought to Europe and reshaped the ways people understood issues such as liberty, equality, and individual rights. Meanwhile, in Britain, during the Age of Enlightenment, enslaved voices reached the world. First came James Somerset, an enslaved African brought to England. In 1772, he escaped, was recaptured, and dragged into court. The case, Somerset versus Steward, shook Britain. The judge ruled that slavery had no basis in English law. It didn't free the colonies, but it meant one thing loud and clear. In England itself, slavery could not stand. Then came Olaudah Equiano, once stolen as a child from Africa, forced onto a slave ship and sold across the seas. Equiano bought his freedom, came to Britain, and in 1789 published his life story. The interesting narrative, it described every horror, the chains, the ships, the cruelty. His words traveled faster than any ship. They reached parlors, universities, churches, and the halls of parliament. Suddenly, slavery was not an abstract trade. It had a human voice. By the early 1800s, public pressure against the slave trade was massive. abolition was not just a moral decoration, it was a real political force. Sugar still sweetened tea, but now it left a bitter aftertaste in the conscience. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, sugar beets were being developed in Europe as an alternative to sugarcane. Napoleon especially pushed beet sugar during the Napoleonic Wars when Britain blockaded French access to Caribbean sugar. Britain noticed too. Sugar could now be grown in a temperate climate, much closer to home, without relying on distant colonies or enslaved labor. This reduced the strategic dependence on Caribbean plantations. The rise of beet sugar made colonies less essential and less profitable, helping to tip the balance. By 1807, Britain banned the slave trade. By 1838, slavery itself ended in its empire. But here's the twist. Britain didn't just ban it, they paid for it. Not to the freed people, but to the enslavers, compensating them for their loss of property. The bill was so enormous, about 17 billion pounds in today's money. The debt wasn't fully repaid until 2015, nearly 2 centuries later. Britain was the master of the sugar empire, and when they ended it, they did so at great financial cost, at their own cost. Britain ended slavery because morality and profit finally aligned. Beet sugar weakened the colony's importance. Slave revolts raised the costs. Revolts, like in Haiti, proved slavery was unstable. Hurricanes and soil exhaustion destroyed plantations. Insurance and military costs to protect colonies skyrocketed, and abolitionists gave the moral banner. The decision was willful, calculated, and paid for, not by enslavers or the enslaved, but by British taxpayers. When Britain and other European powers began abolishing the Atlantic trade, early 1800s, and eventually slavery itself, mid to late 1800s, African leaders could no longer profit from exporting captives. Different regions adapted differently. Many captives who would once have been sold overseas were now kept locally. In West Africa, enslaved populations inside kingdoms like Dahomey, Sokoto, or Asante grew. Because supply war captives continued, but export demand collapsed. Instead of being shipped, captives were put to work in agriculture, especially palm oil, peanuts, cola, military service, or as concubines, domestic labor. Britain pushed African rulers to trade goods, palm oil, ivory, rubber, instead of people. Captives were often exploited as forced labor in these industries. Basically, slavery under a new label, slavery in Africa after the Atlantic trade ended, was still oppressive, but not as extreme, deadly, or dehumanizing as Caribbean chattel slavery. Enslaved Africans in Africa sometimes had paths to integration and survival, whereas in the Caribbean they were deliberately worked to death as replaceable units of labor. While the transatlantic chattel slavery system is gone, forms of slavery and forced labor still exist today, both in Africa and globally. It looks very different, but the exploitation is real. So, was anyone innocent? African leaders sold captives, Europeans built the system, colonists worked people to death. The guilty were many, but the innocent were clear. The men, women, and children chained in ships. The unborn generations denied their futures. The ones who resisted, survived, and still passed on stories. Gold was finite, sugar was infinite, but freedom was the real treasure. And maybe, just maybe, the sweetest thing of all. The freedom to quit and leave is a necessary condition of freedom, but not a sufficient one. It shows you aren't trapped, but true freedom also means having the ability to live with dignity, make meaningful choices, and not face coercion in the first place. In philosophy and ethics, autonomy means the capacity to make your own decisions about your life. Autonomy represents freedom, self-direction, and control over one's own actions, whether for an individual or a community. Kings fought over sugarcane as if it were gold, but the cane taught them nothing lasts forever. Not their profits, not their plantations, not even their empires. The only thing that lasted was the fight for freedom.